Bruxelles, je t'aime. Tu m'avais manqué. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Bruxelles, je t'aime. T'es ma préférée. Bruxelles, je t'aime. Bruxelles, je t'aime.
Hello and welcome to Bruxelles, je t'aime, Euronews' talk show all about the European capital of Brussels. On Brussels, my love, we keep an eye on major European stories, examine what's at stake for you and for Europe. My name is Maeve McMahon. Thanks for joining us. Coming up this week, well, Happy New Year! 2023 has arrived, and with it a heavy agenda on the laps of all those working in EU affairs and, of course, global affairs. With the war ongoing in Ukraine, the shrinking European economy, political divisions across Europe, 2023 could very much be dominated by the same challenges that dictated 2022. But with some fresh January energy, we ask Europeans what their biggest hopes are for this year and ask if politicians are up to the task. And Sweden takes the reins. The Scandinavian country of 10 million people took over from Czechia as head of the European Union Council on the 1st of January. That means Sweden is now tasked with chairing all EU meetings and masterminding all compromises between the European Commission, Council and Parliament until summer. But with a far-right party propping up the government, we ask what impact this will have on EU policies and whether we could see clashes between Brussels and Stockholm. To talk about all these topics and much, much more, I'm joined here in our studio by Oana Lungescu, Chief Spokesperson for NATO. Good to see you. We're also joined by Diederik de Schetsen, Deputy Secretary-General and Campaign Director for the ALDE Party. That's the Pan-European Party for the European Liberal Democrats. We're also joined by Rickard Husu, a Swedish-speaking Finn and correspondent with the Finnish Broadcasting Company. So you're all very welcome. Good
Thank
to
you.
see you.
Thank you.
So here we are in 2023. It has come. Are you happy to see it? Oana, we start with you.
It's always good to see in a new year, and it shows we're still here, and NATO is certainly here. But I think you're right in saying that probably a lot of the same challenges will still be with us. So certainly when it comes to Russia's war in Ukraine, we need to be prepared for the long haul.
So a very busy year it looks like it would be for yourself. What about you, Diederik?
Well, I'm a bit of an optimist, and yes, indeed, we've inherited now in 2023 of a lot of the files and complexities of 2022, which are not going to disappear, but we've made baby steps in the previous year, and if we make just a little bit more baby steps, I think we can reach achievements on some of the important elements that concern us for next year.
And yourself, Rickard?
Well, I would agree that 2023 continues where 2022 left off. Of course, the importance of continuing the support for Ukraine and also fighting against this sense of fatigue that may prevail in some European countries when we see also the effects of rising energy prices, for instance, and just to realize that there's no end game in sight to the war, at least at the moment, and that the support for Ukraine must be there.
OK, well, that's what our panel thinks. Let's now find out what people out and about are thinking on the streets of Brussels. Euronews' Paul Larocque-Oppenau took to the streets to ask passers-by what their hopes for this year are for 2023. Take a listen.
It's time to show strength.
I hope that the war in Ukraine will end.
Less pollution and be more aware of the environment.
That we support the people more after Corona, and there are a lot of people with depressions and stuff, and I hope that that will be better next year, that they help the people more actually.
Improvement of climate change situation.
I would say climate change as well would be really a big issue that needs to be stamped out. Une meilleure cohérence.
Better consistency between the countries regarding the treaties. We need them to fall in line better together. Sometimes some countries disagree. For instance, Poland and Hungary don't follow the same direction as the others, and I think that if we want to be a stronger and unified Europe, these aren't good signals to send to other countries.
I would say just stick with things, making sure the environment gets better and just doing things to make the planet better.
First of all, we need to consider Europe with or without Ukraine. It would be good that in 2023 something positive happens regarding Ukraine. After this, I think that the climate problem is very, very important. Our dear politicians make a lot of meetings. It costs a lot of money, but nothing ever comes out of it. So it's really important for me.
So common thread there really in those clips, a lot of people talking about their concerns over climate change. They want the war to end. They touched on the mental health crisis. Diederik, as you're an optimist, can we start with you? Will the war in Ukraine end this year?
I think we've seen signals saying that the situation might still take some time. Where I find interesting moves was if you see the meeting that Zelensky had with the President of the United States last year, I think there are some elements that show that maybe, and I also would like to stick to your fatigue element of the element. I hope that this might put some pressure into finding a solution to this conflict. I'm very happy to see all the various people you questioned there. I think people are well informed, and also I don't know how much time you took to find all these different questions, but I think they really there is some similarities between the questions they've asked, and I think environment also.
Well, we'll come back to environment. Let's take, because we have a lot to pick through, because in fact they did come up with a lot of topics, but let's stay on that topic of the war, because of course it did dominate 2022. It's likely to dominate as well this year in Europe. And you mentioned fatigue. So Anna, at NATO, are you feeling a sense of fatigue when it comes to the war?
No, we don't. And I think it's really important to remember what the war is about. This war was started by President Putin. It's an illegal war, which he can end today. So the war could end if President Putin decides he's pulling out of Ukraine, and that's how it could work. It would end right now. Unfortunately, we don't really see any indications that President Putin is willing to end the war. If anything, we see him taking an even more prominent position in terms of telling his military commanders what to do. So he's making it even more clearly his own personal war against Ukraine. Of course, all wars, or most wars, will end at the negotiating table in some way or another, and hopefully this one will too. But what happens at the negotiating table really is very closely connected with what happens on the battlefield. And that's why it's really important that we continue to support Ukraine so that it can achieve a just, sustainable peace, and that it can prevail as an independent state in Europe.
Let's get the perspective from yourself. I mean, if you were to take to the streets of Helsinki, would you have similar responses? I mean, what's the situation there regarding the war?
Well, of course, Finns are very concerned about what is happening. I mean, we are very much supporting Ukraine, and there's no doubt in Finland about who is responsible for the war, as you mentioned. I mean, Finns are very clearly saying that this is Putin's war, this is an aggression against Ukraine, and also Finland is supporting Ukraine, both in terms of humanitarian aid and also with weapons at the moment. And I think it has a very broad backing also among Finns.
And the role, of course, of NATO has changed, has transformed in the last couple of years. We remember, was it back in 2019 when the French President Emmanuel Macron was calling NATO brain dead? And now NATO has come into its own again with an expansion planned, with your country planning to join, and of course Sweden.
Well, actually, the war started in 2014. It started with Putin's illegal annexation of Crimea and the start of the destabilization of the Donbass. And it is actually since 2014 that NATO has been adapting and adjusting to this new security reality, which we now see as the biggest crisis in European security since World War II. And since then, we have been strengthening our deterrence and defense. And that's what we continue to do. And that's what we've continued to do in 2022. So that there is no misunderstanding in Moscow.
Started back in 2014. Of course, that's something Ukrainians are always reminding us here in Europe. So unlike Europeans, were you then not surprised when the invasion took place?
Well, there's lots of Europeans in NATO, of course, and they all sit around the table. So it may be that some people had a different analysis of what was happening, but no, NATO was not surprised. Actually, since autumn 21, we raised the alarm signals, we rang the alarm bells, and we, for the first time, I think, in NATO history, declassified a very large amount of intelligence showing what was being prepared on the ground, and warning people that this was what was happening, also to expose Putin's playbook. And we also engaged in political dialogue with Russia through the NATO-Russia Council, but clearly Putin's mind was made up and he went on to illegally start this full-fledged invasion of Ukraine.
Okay, well, you mentioned Europeans. Let's get the perspective from some members of the European Parliament. Our reporter Shandor Ziros was at the last plenary session of last year, back in 2022, over in Strasbourg, asking members of the European Parliament what they felt the biggest challenges for 2022 were and what their hopes for this year are. Take a listen.
The biggest fight was to avoid the Green Deal, the European Green Deal and the Fit for 55 to be derailed. Well, we have managed that in a way, but on the other hand, you can feel the pressure to weaken the ambition of the Green Deal, and that is a serious concern of ours.
We have the energy crisis, which is affecting all Europeans. We now need to face it both because it's a matter of protecting the climate of our planet, but also because it's a security issue. We can't be dependent on Putin and we can't be blackmailed by an authoritarian state like that. So I shall persevere in trying to persuade this House and other EU institutions and indeed member states that it's high time to get serious about European defence.
So that's the Polish MEP there, Radoslaw Sikorski, saying it's high time for Europeans to get serious about defence. Deirdre, I'd like to look at you because you're also the campaign party for your party, preparing for the elections that will take place in 2024 in Europe. But do you think spending on defence is something that your voters are willing to do?
That's correct. Well, first of all, I think there's two sources here. It's one, we actually do have a resolution in terms of our ALDE party where we actually do call for strengthening European defence and also for a European army. However, I think if you look at the Eurostats, which is these general questionnaires sent out at a very large amount of European citizens, you can see that having a bigger EU in the world is something that has been topping the lists in the top 5 for a very long time. And I think to be able to be stronger in the world, you need to have, with the soft power, you need to have some strong power with it. And I think there is indeed a majority of the people where this is something they would welcome, because it gives us something to indeed strengthen the soft politics we have in the world and the soft diplomacy we're playing.
What about your viewers in Finland and over in Sweden as well? Do you think there's an appetite there for people to spend on that?
Well, I think so, definitely. I mean, of course, us becoming members hopefully very soon in NATO, we are still waiting for the final ratification process, but I think the preparation is ongoing at the moment, and of course it will also affect our defense spending. I mean, Finland has been spending very much already, and I think our defense forces are very up for it already as it is, but of course, I mean, just adapting to this new structure and being a part of a 30 plus 30 country alliance will of course be a challenge also in the upcoming months.
Okay, we will keep an eye on that, and of course on that ratification. Just very briefly, because I would like to move on to the topic of climate change, which is also a concern of passers-by. Okay.
Well, we're all looking forward to Finland and Sweden being part of NATO very soon, and this has been a historic decision taken by all 30 NATO allies back in July 22. Everybody realizes that with Finland and Sweden, NATO will be stronger, Finland and Sweden will be safer, and all of us in the Euro-Atlantic area will be more secure. But let me just make one point on European defence. It is actually through the pledge taken by all NATO leaders back in 2014 that we have seen an increase in defence spending among European allies and Canada, with an extra 350 billion euros added to our defence spending, and hopefully that's a trend that will be important to continue seeing among NATO allies in 23.
Okay, we shall keep an eye on that, and NATO will, of course, be meeting this summer in July for their big summit. Let's talk about climate change. It's a major concern of people here in Europe, as we've seen in our clip earlier, and also according to records, last year was the driest and the hottest here in Europe. Diedrich, I'd like to ask you though, has the war scuppered the plans of this continent to go green?
Well, I'll go back to there is a life before politics, and I used to work in renewable energies here at the European level, and I was one that really was in favor of renewable energies, mostly because of the energy supply element. And so I think the element now of strategic autonomy, which is now the popular word, is indeed about that. It is about managing Europe a little bit like you would manage your household, is to make sure you're not dependent too much of one supplier. People mention the gas that comes from Russia. People forget that in the case of Belgium, because I'm Belgian, nobody's perfect, or uranium, actually, there are other providers, but actually do come from Russia too. So this element, to answer your question, is that yes, I think the war and the security, the energy crisis it generated will strengthen the energy to push us to go for more renewables and more autonomy again in energy. So yes, it will have a positive effect on that element.
And Richard, what's your take? I mean, a lot was pulled through last year, of course, with the Repower EU, and a lot of deals were clinched.
Well, I think, it's a very good position for the Swedish presidency. We'll talk about that later, I think. But to take over after the Czech presidency now, some big compromises at the end of 2022. And I think just in general, the Fit for 55 package is all the more relevant now when we see how energy is being weaponized against Europe. So if people have any doubt regarding, if this is a sensible policy, we are seeing now the effects of what can happen if we are too dependent on a few providers, and I think it's just been an eye-opening process for many in Europe.
And Oana, just from your perspective, where you're sitting when it comes to climate change, NATO also is putting their plans, but of course the arms industry, it's a tricky one to go green.
Yeah, it's a long-term effort, but clearly climate change is an existential challenge for all of us, so we can't afford to ignore the climate and the world we live in. It is a crisis that has been very much at the top of NATO's agenda. It now figures much more prominently in our new strategic concept, which was adopted in 22. We have targets for reducing emissions for NATO, and it really is important for us both to mitigate the impact of climate change when it comes to our operations, to our headquarters, but also to contribute to dealing with this issue, which of course is a conflict multiplier. So it makes other conflicts around the world much worse.
Many there focusing on protecting the planet. I'm not sure if you saw just before Christmas a deal was clinched at the COP15. Did you see that? A deal that was actually 4 years being negotiated. A deal that brings about targets to protect 30% of the planet. And we can show you a tweet there from the Commissioner in charge of the environment saying, "Deal, we made history." Will this deal, do you think, do the trick, Diedrich? Will this protect the planet in the way that's needed?
I think you'll need a lot of deals to really make history. I think this is one of them. I think the EU can do at its level also even more. But I think this will not solve all the issues. But we have reached a momentum where I think if you just go back a couple of years ago, there were still a lot of people on the critical side of the effects of that humans have on the climate. I think now we at least have a united front. Maybe that's not enough, but I think at least that's one step. We have steps that are made at the level of COP, at the EU. Even NATO, wouldn't have immediately reflected on their schemes of environment. But if we all have the same attitudes, I do think we can achieve a lot.
Okay.
Well, steps are taken forward, at least. I mean, there's no doubt regarding that. I think a few years ago there was questions regarding major global players and their involvement in this fight against climate change. Now it's at least evident that all the main players are along and working for the same goal, so that's surely important.
Brief comment from you?
Yeah, it's clearly an issue of security, of all of our security, and it takes all of us working together.
Okay. And Diedrich, just a final question for yourself, because you're the campaign leader. I mean, the trust was broken between regular European citizens just before Christmas when we saw that scandal at the European Parliament. How are you building this trust? Because your party, of course, is seen a little bit like the party of the rich and the elite.
Oh, I'm not sure about that, though. Or in that case, we should work on our comms, because I don't think that's true. On the other hand, there is an element where this was a real shockwave, and sometimes it's used politically a bit lightly to add some emotion. Here it's not. It really has put us to the core, and especially that an institution as the Parliament is being affected by this. It will take really a lot of time. It fundamentally, personally touched me also in the fact that I'm really thinking damage has been done, and before the elections we will have to make so much time to rebuild trust even before we can send our values. So it has really disappointed me, and I hope, or no, let's use stronger words for once. We really do have to make sure this won't happen again at that level, and also that there are actions for those who have committed this breach of trust.
Yeah, because of course the incident took place allegedly in the European Parliament, and it impacts a couple of MEPs and one former MEP, but of course it stains the whole European Union and its foundations. Well, that is, I'm afraid, all we have time for on this topic. Thank you so much for your insights and thank you for watching. Do stay with us though, because after the break, we'll be telling you how Sweden plans to steer the European Union for the next 6 months. See you soon here on Euronews and Euronews.com. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, with me, Maeve McMahon, where we're taking a look at some of the big stories that could dominate here in Europe in 2023. Now, a few things changed on the 1st of January here. Croatia joined the Eurozone and Schengen, and Sweden took over as presidency of the European Union. Will that mean anything to any of you? Will this change anything in your life, Diedrich?
Yes, very operationally, because as some might know, but before big meetings, the ministers come together in their political family. And so having there some of our ministers that will chair this council will have some effect because we have a good contact with them. So that will change something for sure.
And you, as a Swedish-speaking Finn, you'll be busy, I'm sure.
Well, I'm always following Sweden closely, of course, also because of language ties to the country. But I think it's interesting to see they have a new government now, new ministers, new faces, of course, in charge of this whole apparatus now for 6 months. So it will be interesting to see how they cope with that. But on the other hand, I mean, it's nothing new. Finland was in the same position in 2019 as the chair. We also had a very new government, so apparently it's doable.
And from your perspective, I guess it just means you need to create new contacts, no, and network more with those working?
Well, we already have the contacts because, of course, Sweden, like Finland, is sitting at the table of the North Atlantic Council because they will soon be NATO members. And Sweden has actually already briefed the North Atlantic Council, the 30 ambassadors, about their priorities, stressing that NATO-EU cooperation will remain a priority in 2023. Just as it's been for the Czech presidency. And for us, of course, looking forward to Sweden and Finland to join NATO very soon, it's worth reminding everybody that with that accession, 96% of the population of the European Union will be protected by NATO. 96%.
Well, let's just check in with our viewers and remind them why Sweden will be in the spotlight for the next 6 months and a little bit more insight and context into the EU presidency. Take a listen.
A new year brings new leadership in the Council of the EU. The Czech Republic handed the baton over to Sweden on New Year's Day as its 6-month presidency began. Every half year, a new EU country takes the reins, giving it a central role in setting and progressing the bloc's policy agenda. Stockholm has already laid out its priorities. These include managing the response to the war in Ukraine and the implementation of the European Green Deal. But there's one snag. The far-right Eurosceptic Sweden Democrats are propping up the government. Brussels fears they want to frustrate the EU's lawmaking process, which for now is something only they will know.
So, Christopher Pitcher is there. Diedrich, what will all this mean, Sweden being at the reins of the European Union?
Well, I know Sweden very well. My wife is Swedish. I've lived there a long enough time. I think if you can stereotype a little bit, there is an element, and what you can see now also, of preparation that was important. And the Swedish team, and I've seen them that will manage the presidency, have been there and are already preparing since a very long time at the permanent representation. You mentioned the element of the far right. In the agreement of the current government, they remain fully independent as part of the EU policy. That remains to be seen also in practice, but there's good hopes also that indeed the independence of a government, especially on the presidency, will be fully guaranteed.
Will there be clashes between Brussels and Stockholm, and on what specific issues?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't exaggerate the importance of the Sweden Democrats here. It's a domestic policy issue foremost. If you listen to the debate in the Swedish parliament, of course, the government is constantly reminded by the opposition that they are governing with the support of the Sweden Democrats. But it remains to be seen if it will actually affect this 6-month presidency. I doubt it.
And one thing I heard the Swedes are planning to do is hold all their meetings right next door to the airport. So no fancy castles or no grandiose motorcades through the city. I mean, this is sending a symbol, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the first time I hear of it, but why not? Not that there aren't lots of wonderful places in Stockholm or across Sweden where these meetings could be held. But yeah, I tend to agree with Richard that I think what matters is we see consensus, that's also very Swedish, on the key issues. That is support for Ukraine and also membership of NATO. And at the end, these are the fundamentals.
And Diedrich, this whole idea of having an EU presidency, a rotating EU presidency, do you think it's something that's a good idea, that people appreciate this idea?
Well, I find there is a little bit of a difference between indeed how people in the street view it and maybe the EU bubble, as we refer to those. Because the relevancy of presidencies is debatable. You could argue how much the role is. You could very minimalistically say that they just chair this meeting and that's it. Or you could really see it a bit like half full or half empty glass, that it has a very important role. The reality is I noticed that there is a really a whole element of motivation and energy that comes with these new presidencies, and that people really get excited about this and do see. So in that way, even though it's half full or half empty, it does have a positive influence in engaging citizens in this.
And you mentioned earlier, Oana, briefly?
No, I agree with Diedrich. I mean, we don't have rotating presidents in NATO, but I think bringing the whole posse of ministers or heads of state to a capital or somewhere else in the country does create a buzz. Certainly for NATO, we've just had a foreign ministerial in Bucharest, my home city, and, just seeing the NATO flag everywhere on buses, it really creates a lot of buzz and interest, and people try to find out more about, what are these ministers talking about.
Well, time will tell whether the Swedes get involved in that excitement and buzz. But climate change, you said earlier, will be a big topic. What exactly regarding policy concrete do you think they will be able to achieve?
Well, of course, one question which is interesting is the role of forestry. Sweden is saying that they will be an honest broker, as it's always said about the presidency, so they will strive for compromise between the countries. But then, of course, there are these issues that are very specific to the Scandinavian countries. For instance, the role of forestry when it comes to climate change and the role of forest as carbon sinks. And there, of course, the Swedes have been saying that, okay, we accept this challenge and we are very much for reducing the effect of climate change, but on the other hand, we can't be a carbon sink for the whole of Europe. There's a limit to how far we can go, and I'm sure even if I don't doubt that they will be an honest broker, but I think they will also use the opportunity to kind of remind the rest of Europe that Sweden and Finland indeed also is a big country geographically, and that there's lots of forest in both of these countries.
And it's an industry in that country. That is how you have to see it, and you understand more their interest in the question, if you view it like that. Absolutely.
Well, that is all I'm afraid for. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid, on that topic. But do stay with us here on Euronews and Euronews.com. Hello and welcome back to Brussels, my love, with me, Maeve McMahon, where we're taking a look ahead at what 2023 could bring for Europe. I also want to get a little bit personal now and ask our panellists what you all hope for 2023 and what your dreams and goals are. Diedrich, we start with you.
Yeah, I think when you reach a little bit more than 40, which I have now, I think health is really the thing you want for the next years. But I think I'm really excited because 2024 is the election year, right? Again, I mentioned I was Belgian, so we'll have it at local level, regional, federal, and the European one, and that is preparing before. That's happening now. So now we'll have to indeed build up trust again. We'll have to see what matters. And these are very exciting times into politics because this is, I was going to make a battlefield references, but in this day and age, we can't do that. But it is really now that the action is going, and that's really exciting.
So I can see politics is kind of your hobby as well as your job.
That's correct.
Rickard, what's your take?
Well, the elections are certainly interesting. On a personal note, read books, play the piano, visit the opera if I have a chance to. That's something I hope for every year. And on a more general note, of course, peace in Ukraine and a free Ukraine. That's what I'm hoping.
For Ukraine. And I guess it's more time. But
more sleep, maybe. That's also an aspiration I have every year. I mean, last year obviously was not the year to sleep, but it was the year to be prepared, and we were prepared. So I think we just need to remain prepared and vigilant. But it also means from time to time you need to do other stuff. So yeah, we have to prepare for the Vilnius summit, the NATO summit in July, which will be, I think, part of this transformative decade that started since 2014, where I'm sure we will be taking more decisions to strengthen our defence and deterrence, hopefully to embrace Sweden and Finland as new members, but also to look forward to what happens to our defence spending, because the defence spending pledge that we adopted in 2014 will come to an end. So it's interesting to see that more and more NATO allies are seeing 2% of GDP on defence as a floor, not a ceiling. So watch that space.
So what stories should we be looking out for, Diedrich, this year? And what movers and shakers are there out there in Europe that our viewers should be checking out?
There's a lot of women that don't get enough attention, I think, and that should follow. I think for Nordic countries, they know about it, but if you look at a prime minister like Kaja Kallas and what she's been doing, I think she deserves more attention. It's a small country, but it's really some of these women that really play an important role and should be put up front. I am a terrible and very enthusiastic fan of people like Margrethe Vestager at the European Commission. I think following these profiles is really something that gives you, again, a bit hope and faith in the European project. And I think that is a very motivating thing to do, and also makes you feel good for the coming year. So follow these profiles.
We'll also have an election in Finland in April, so it will be very interesting to see what our current, in what position our current Prime Minister Sanna Marin will be in April, and what other positions might be available.
You know, Bild, the German newspaper, called her the coolest politician in the world last year.
Well, I mean, I can imagine, because there's a huge interest. I mean, she's a global phenomenon.
Great dance moves.
Yep.
And same question to yourself, any movers and shakers?
I think for us it's more steady hand on the till rather than moving and shaking. I think there's a lot of that happening anyway. So I'll be very loyal and mention my boss Jens Stoltenberg, who I think has had a very calm, measured, responsible approach to the conflict in Ukraine. And we need a lot of that. We need cool heads in Europe.
Well, his hand is still on the till because he was forced to do that. People didn't want him to leave because of the current situation.
Yeah, he had a very good job actually, running the Norwegian central bank and the biggest sovereign fund in the world. But he gave that up because NATO leaders asked him to stay on until September of 23.
So maybe there could be a mover in the talent of NATO in one head of state that should leave in one country. That would be really helping for the...
That's well above my pay grade.
Oana, thank you so much. Diedrich, thank you so much. Rickard, thank you so much. And thank you so much to you as well for watching and for being with us here always on Euronews. And of course, Happy New Year. I hope it's a great one. Look after yourself and we'll see you soon here on Euronews and Euronews.com.